Happy late New Year, guys! I initially planned on getting this retrospective out by January, but unfortunately, YouTube doesn't seem to like creators in the month of January. But the good news is that long-lasting Blue Monday is over, and we are starting off the year with the Nintendo 3DS retrospective once again. And with that being said, here's to great 2023!
You are now watching The Beach!
We started off 2021 with a retrospective of Mario Kart 7, and we started off 2022 with a critical look at the not-so-new New Super Mario Bros. 2. And going into 2023, we'll be taking a look at what is perhaps one of the weirdest Nintendo 3DS games of all time. It was March 3rd, what would have been my junior year in high school, but I did early college, though the time period still stands. Nintendo was ready to release what was going to end up being their best-selling and most popular console of all time, much to my dismay, the Nintendo Switch. Back when it initially released, the future was looking brighter than ever for Nintendo. They just released their brand new hybrid console, launching with one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, that being none other than Super Bomberman R. To be fair, the game is pretty good, but I'm obviously referring to none other than The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. We would have to wait a bit, but Nintendo was set to bring Mario into the new generation with Super Mario Odyssey in October of that year, a marvel for the Super Mario series. It was then March 7th. Nintendo was set to release another game, a remake of a Wii game, Kirby's Epic Yarn, released that very day, but instead of being for the Nintendo Switch, it instead opted for the Nintendo 3DS. You might think there's not much unusual about that. Nintendo consoles tend to get a bit more support, even after a new console releases. And you would be correct. We saw Kirby Mass Attack release on the Nintendo DS a few months after the 3DS launched. What I told you is that the Nintendo Switch and Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn both released in the month of March. What I didn't tell you is that the Switch launched in March of 2017, and Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn launched an entire 2 years after the Switch launched in 2019. Let's put things into perspective. In the span from March 2017 to March 2019, we got The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and most importantly, Kirby Star Allies, all before Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn. Even though I'm not crazy about Star Allies, that is a new mainline Kirby game on a new system that released before a game on a console that had been out for 8 years prior. Nintendo's support of the 3DS after the launch of the Switch is one of their most baffling eras. I understood supporting the 3DS maybe a year after the Switch launched, and to be fair, most games released after were remakes or were on a smaller scale. But as time went on, it was getting increasingly apparent that a majority of these late 3DS games were at a huge disadvantage, not only because they weren't selling well, but because almost all of them could have heavily benefited by being on the Switch. Because obviously, Luigi's Mansion should have been remade for the dinky 3DS instead of the HD Switch, and the absurdity of late 3DS support was fully realized when Mario and Luigi Bowser's Inside Story plus Bowser Jr.'s Journey released in January of 2019. It got the Poison Mushroom Award of being one of the worst-selling Mario games of all time and one of the worst-selling Nintendo games of all time. So much so that it caused an entire development studio to go defunct, and there were just so many contributing factors as to why that game bombed harder than Mouser. It's likely that this game in particular caused the demise of the Nintendo 3DS, and that caused any further games to either shift development to the Switch or be scrapped altogether. But the Nintendo 3DS did have one last hurrah before going out. Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is the final first-party Nintendo 3DS game, and unlike Bowser's Inside Story, this game didn't have as many disadvantages. It's a remake of a Wii game instead of a backwards-compatible DS game. It also didn't release alongside a major Switch release, and it released in March, a far better month to release a game than in January. So with that being said, I'm sure it sold decently enough, and getting a copy should be no Oh no. I already sold my kidney for Wii Sports Club, and I'm not selling my soul to Nintendo. Nintendo Twitter and Reddit already do that enough, and considering the eShop won't let you add funds, I need to get a physical copy. This is something I don't take lightly, but I feel is necessary. You guys are getting a retrospective of Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn, even if it's the last thing I do. Hey, you can't rob us! Oh yeah? Well, it's not robbing if I'm robbing from robbers. So the question is Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn the swan song of the Nintendo 3DS, or is it nothing more than a tangled mess? Our story begins with the mysterious force taking over Dreamland, turning everything into yarn. Kirby obviously is more concerned about what he's going to eat, and comes across a Maxim tomato. It turns out our main antagonist Yin Yarn wanted the tomato, and he did the only sensible thing. No negotiation, there's no negotiating peace. Let's turn Kirby into yarn! Kirby then teams up with a yarn boy named Prince Fluff, and it's up to them to save the day. This is just a basic summary of the story. Most platformers don't have an emphasis on story, but Kirby is the exception, hence why I only gave a synopsis to avoid spoilers. But what did I think? The story itself is told as if it were a storybook. There's a charming narrator telling the story, and more of it unfolds throughout the game, literally and figuratively. It definitely isn't as deep as most Kirby stories, but it's quite charming and already gives the game an edge. Story isn't the most important factor in a platformer, but having one can go a long way. It can make a game stand out more and more and be a more memorable experience, but the story is quite literally the cherry on the sundae because Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is a very unique game. Kirby's Epic Yarn initially released in 2010. This is when 2D platformers saw a sort of renaissance after the absence that occurred during the generation of gaming when everything went into 3D. And when 2D platformers did return, they consisted of more basic game design, like the new Super Mario Bros. Games. Now, I love the first two new Super Mario Bros. Games, and there's nothing wrong with a more straightforward experience, but what separates modern 2D platformers from classic ones are their organic game design. This essentially means level design that doesn't feel like it was designed on a grid, things like mechanics that allow you to interact with the environments, and just the overall feeling of something that couldn't have been done on older hardware. Kirby's Epic Yarn and Donkey Kong Country Returns were the start of the 2D platformer renaissance for me. Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is a remake of the original on Wii, and the core game remains identical. You'll be playing through 8 wonderfully crafted worlds, and quite literally, crafted levels. Epic Yarn was one of the very first arts and crafts themed games, and at the time, it was an incredibly novel and unique concept, but something like that could often resort to being either a gimmick or just the art style of the game. Though to be fair, I'd take that art style over Kirby's epic Pokemon art style any day. But Epic Yarn weaves past the gimmick territory and incorporates yarn and crafts in fun and clever ways. You'll be interacting with the environments in ways like pulling yarn ropes to uncover items or beads, or even swinging like a pendulum. Kirby's movement is also so much fun in the game. Unlike traditional Kirby games, he can't float, but he can turn into a parachute to glide down safely, and when he runs, he turns into a car. It's clever touches like that that make Epic Yarn such a unique and engaging game. These abilities are mostly cosmetic, but there are different abilities, being the super transformations. Kirby can turn into various different vehicles or animals. If you've ever played Yoshi's Island, they work similar to the transformations in that game, or a more recent example would be the mouthful abilities in Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Levels are designed around these specific abilities, and they're a blast to use. There's a ton of variety with the transformations as well. In one level, you'll have Kirby transform into a mole, digging through stuffing, and in another, Kirby can extinguish fire by turning into a fire truck. And who wouldn't love Dolphin Kirby? There are many of these abilities, and they're a major aspect of the game, but considering this is a Kirby game, you might expect Kirby to be able to inhale enemies and copy their abilities, but that is not the case when Kirby is made out of yarn. His metabolism just can't take it. In the original game, Kirby couldn't use any copy abilities whatsoever, but this is Extra Epic Yarn, and it did include something extra. Copy abilities are now in the game under the name of Ravel abilities. Kirby dons costumes made out of art supplies and is given classic abilities, things like the sword, tornado, that kind of stuff. At face value, it might seem like a good addition. Who doesn't want to see Kirby go full on Peter Pan? And in most cases, copy abilities are crucial to the part of a Kirby game. The fact that Kirby's Epic Yarn didn't have any of them made the game feel less like a Kirby game, but the Ravel abilities in Extra Epic Yarn make the game feel more like a traditional Kirby game. The abilities are what you'd expect, and they're a blast to use, and in turn, they make the game a lot faster paced and more action-oriented. See, in the original Epic Yarn, you'd often have to roll up enemies into yarn balls and then throw it at an area that's blocked off so you could access it. and a lot of the game was centered around that mechanic, but with the ravel abilities, they are fun to use, but they essentially take that aspect of the game away. Can't make a yarn ball? No problem. Slice and dice away, which can also make the game even easier. Kirby's Epic Yarn was already very easy to begin with, and the ravel abilities make an easy game even easier, but I do appreciate how they increase the pace of the game, as well as how much fun they are to use. As I stated before, the levels are often centered around the yarn mechanics and transformations, but the overall level design is excellent. It's not your typical platformer that's centered around taking out enemies and reaching the end. It's more about exploration and collecting. Levels will have 3 treasure chests containing various different items, essentially acting like the star coins from New Super Mario Bros. I'm always a fan of collectibles like this, considering they add a lot of depth to the levels, but there are also the beads to collect, which act as Kirby's health. I say this because if you get hit, you lose them, but you can't directly lose. This is one of the reasons why people say the game is too easy, but the thing is, you still get punished for getting hit or falling down a pit, because you'll need a certain amount of beads to get the highest ranking. You'll be awarded a medal with gold being the highest, and you'll need to have many beads to achieve it, and honestly, I prefer a system like this over lives and game overs. It also gives the levels more replay value, which is always welcome. The gameplay of Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is mostly excellent. It was also excellent on the Wii, and it's mostly the same here, and while the ravel abilities are fun, they can make the game too easy. The core experience is mostly the same as the original, but not much is really extra about it. But considering this is a 3DS remake, maybe the focus was the presentation? We have quite a few 3D remakes, and even Bowser's Inside Story got a graphical overhaul, so they probably did something cool with it. If anyone says graphics don't matter in a game, I won't even give a detailed explanation, because all I need to say is Kirby's Epic Yarn. The game goes all out with the yarn and fabric theme, and this is most apparent with the presentation. Goodfeel is known for making incredible looking games, and Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is no exception. This proves that a good art direction goes a long way, even if the tech isn't powerful, and on the 3DS, it still looks great. The resolution is lower, but it looks good if you're playing it on the system. But even though it still looks great, there's a pretty big issue. Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is playable in 2D only. Now, if this game released in 2016 or something, I wouldn't be too miffed. But this is a game released in March of 2019, an entire 2 years after the Switch. The only benefit of having it on the 3DS would be having the 3D, but instead, you're just left with the Wii game, but at a lower resolution. Yeah, it still looks good, but this so-called extra remake is not exactly justifying it being a 3DS game. I thought the Luigi's Mansion 3DS remake was stupid, and definitely should have been on Switch, but at least you could say it had 3D. But again, Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is feeling kinda pointless. Hopefully some of the music will cheer me up. The music in Extra Epic Yarn is great. Epic Yarn had a soundtrack mostly composed on a piano, and it sounds great. And it's the same here. The best way I can describe the presentation is that it's incredible because it's Kirby's Epic Yarn, but it's disappointing as a remake. It easily would have benefited being an HD remake on the Switch. So far, there's not much extra about Extra Epic Yarn, but maybe, just maybe, content could be where the focus went. Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn has 8 worlds and an ample amount of levels. It is longer than your standard Kirby game, and that's not even accounting for the collectibles and rankings. If you're going to 100% it, you're in for quite some time. But Extra Epic Yarn has even more content beyond the main story mode. This is where most of the focus went remaking the game. The main criticism Kirby's Epic Yarn got was that it was too easy. So in Extra Epic Yarn, there's a new hard mode called Devilish Mode. Usually with hard modes, enemies are more frequent and deal more damage, or you'll have less health. Sometimes the platforms are adjusted. Kirby in Devilish Mode has a health meter where he can only take 5 hits, and you actually can lose. So far so good, right? A hard mode is definitely something Epic Yarn could have benefited from. But unfortunately, Devilish Mode isn't even a hard mode. It's an annoying mode! You'll have this devil enemy appear that chases after Kirby. He acts similar to the Angry Sun from the Mario series, but unlike the Angry Sun, this devilish buffoon is in every single level. Does it make it harder? Yes. But is it fun to play? No! It's not! And to make matters even worse, There's a music track that plays every time the devil is on screen. So if you like the wonderful soundtrack, well, that's too bad. It's not hard to make a hard mode, but somehow Extra Epic Yarn managed to tangle it up. What a bummer. What a bummer considering that this was one of the main selling points of the game. But there's also a bit more in terms of extras, such as with King DDD and Meta Knight's minigames. What's going to happen there? Is it just going to be a bunch of Hammer Brothers and Lakitus? Because it sure seems like it will be. Okay, good news. It's not. These minigames are actually quite good. Meta Knight's Slash and Beads is essentially a 2D hack and slash game. Your goal is to slash enemies and collect beads while trying to go for the highest ranking. It's pretty fun, though not exactly substantial. It's a bit too easy, and while I did have some fun with it, it didn't resonate much with me. But the other minigame, DDD Go Go Go, genuinely surprised me, and it had me have a smile on my face just saying it here. What is essentially DDD Go 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 is that it's an auto runner where you play as King DDD. The objectives are to collect beads and clear the levels as fast as possible to achieve the highest ranking. This is a really fun game, and it's more than just your standard auto runner. DDD can run and jump, but he can also attack by swinging and do a sweet penguin slide, and the level design is excellent as well. Poochie and Yoshi's Woolly World also had some excellent auto-running levels with Poochie, and I wouldn't be surprised if a developer from that game also worked on this. They are both made by Goodfeel, so I wouldn't be surprised. Honestly, these would make for some pretty good mobile Nintendo games. The only problem here is that these minigames are too short, only lasting for about 4 levels each. If Meta Knight's Slash and Beads, and especially DDD Go 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 were more fleshed out, and each had 15 to 20 or so levels, that right there would do this remake a lot of justice. But while they're excellently designed, they're just too short, lasting less than an hour in total at the max. They're also tied to story progression, so you'll only be able to unlock all the levels by playing the main game. In terms of content, Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn has an ample amount of content, but in terms of new content, not so much. Devilish mode is just bad, and the minigames are unfortunately too short, and even though it's called Extra Epic Yarn, co-op from the original has been removed. The 3DS is not really ideal for multiplayer, so it's not really a major issue. But since when does extra mean removing content? Since Deluxe meant adding Peachette? I guess so. But with that being said, the minigames are nice additions. I just wish there was more to them. So far I've established Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn has excellent gameplay, and the Ravel abilities are a cool addition. The presentation is great, but it's not going to look as nice on the 3DS and it lacks 3D. And there's a lot of content, but not much new content. So what's the verdict? Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is an absolute anomaly of a game. It attempts to address Epic Yarn's flaws, but it does so in ways that aren't thought out well, that serve as a detriment. The only additions that are cool are the minigames, and to an extent, the Ravel abilities, but the minigames are just far too short, and overall, this is a really weird game. This was the final first-party Nintendo 3DS game. It released 2 years after the Nintendo Switch, and a whopping 8 years after the Nintendo 3DS launched. Mario and Luigi Bowser's Inside Story and Bowser Jr.'s Journey is a very similar case where it's also a very late 3DS game, and it's a remake. But with that game, as bad as the circumstances surrounding it were, it at least made some sense. Alpha Dream already had the engine for the Mario and Luigi games on the 3DS, and it looked significantly better than the original, and it included some nice quality of life improvements, not to mention having an entire side campaign. And while it was stupid to release it on the 3DS, I at least can understand it to an extent. Not that I agree with it, but I do understand where they were coming from, I guess. But there's no reason why Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn shouldn't have been a Switch game, because it does nothing to take advantage of the 3DS's capabilities, and the 3DS really only brings the game down. As a remake, Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is tarnished bronze. Not completely horrible, but it's pointless. More leaning to trash if you're wondering. But as a game, Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn is still treasure. It's still Kirby's Epic Yarn, which is such a fun and creative platformer that's one of my favorites in the Kirby series. But unless you're a collector or really love Kirby, I'd stick with the original on Wii. Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn does serve as a fitting swan song for the Nintendo 3DS though, because it perfectly represents the final years of the system. Now it's time to say goodbye. Remakes that should have been on the Switch. Nintendo 3DS, BYE. It's time to say goodbye. But in the end of the day, the Nintendo 3DS is an excellent system, and when everyone thought it would fail because of the rise of smartphones when it launched, it ended up lasting for nearly a decade, and if that's not a story to tell you to follow your dreams, I don't know what is. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments, and keep calm and dada on.